Anke, really nice to talk to you today. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good. How are you, Andrew?
Yeah, very, very good. We're going to be talking very shortly about your book, Cult Trip. But the first thing is, how do you define what a cult is?
There's usually a charismatic slash narcissistic leader who is influential in some ways and often where different rules apply and where there's a lot of, doesn't even have to be the devotional worshipping, but, and then you have groupthink. You have an inability for people to actually speak up and be critical or really question what they're being taught. There's always a us versus them mentality. And again, it can just be subtle. You might not pick it up straight away. Yeah. It could just be that, everyone's on board and thinks, if everyone's doing this out there in the world, what we're doing here, gosh, the world would be a better place. So let's make sure we invite all our friends and we do all this as volunteers. So exploitation slash volunteer work, a lot of that. Love bombing, cultic groups feel great when you get into them. There's usually you have a honeymoon phase, like with any, like it's very similar actually to relationships, one-on-one relationships that turn into domestic, or interpartner violence, where people don't get together because they want to be with someone who's going to beat them up a year later. Obviously not. It's exactly the same thing, and this is why it's so hard to leave. And then, there's so many markers of what makes a cult, but I think another big one is this promise of transformation. That you're going in there because something needs to change, or you want something to change, whether it's you or the world or whatever it is, or something about yourself. And those things are all deeply human. None of that is wrong. So I think they're the best qualities actually in people that bring them into these cultic groups, and that includes myself, because I was put into something where at the time I also couldn't see it really for what it was, and now I'm quite critical of it, and it's given me a lot of compassion and understanding why we can't always see these dynamics around us so easily. We're much better at spotting them in other people or other groups.
So, can I ask you, for you, was it a desire for connection, or what that drew you to that side of things?
I mean, first of all, every human being has a desire for connection. From the moment we're born, we would die without it, right? So that's a natural trait, but everyone, I guess, quenches that thirst in different ways. Some people do it at the pub, some people do it at rugby or, clubs or whatever. I wasn't out there looking for that. I think I was looking more something, it was more like self development and it's going to all sound very woo-woo because it was at the time, but I was on a bit of a quest, maybe as a middle-aged woman looking for something in my life, and then thought, oh, here are these people teaching something that I've always, was very cynical about as a journalist because it sounds so new agey and so esoterical. And but at the time, suddenly it could land, and I think there are lots of reasons for that. Maybe also being an immigrant here in New Zealand, being of a certain age, being whatever it was, something can land at the right time, and everyone's susceptible. And I'm the living example for this as a cult journalist who's come too close, not just in her research to some cults, but also come too close myself to some groups and was entangled and couldn't really see it for what it was.
I think you mentioned in the book something about that a lot of these individuals or organizations or communities, they manipulate what are genuine and often altruistic tendencies in people. So they manipulate the goodwill that's in people, or the yearning that people have.
Absolutely, and this is
Yeah.
why I think this is why it's so important to talk about it, because people in cults often do really bad things, and they started off wanting to do good things, and they come in there as good people with good intentions. And if you paint a bigger picture and look at these cults as microcosms of like little dictatorships, like little fascist abusive systems, whatever, and then you look at countries where that has happened, like country I'm from, Germany or so on, then maybe you get where I'm getting at, that people can be taken in a certain direction that doesn't really let them off the hook. I think there needs to be some accountability, especially after the fall, especially after they've come out or after they've been called out on what they've done. But it's often the best qualities that really bring them there. And yeah, like you said, the altruism, the need for more than just a materially focused life, yeah, but actually wanting to fill your time with deeper connections, or with doing something for others, or a spiritual quest.
You mentioned before this almost honeymoon period where the leaders of these organizations draw people in, but then over time they start doing techniques to break people's spirits, particularly if they have something traumatic or some kind of weakness. And then, as you mentioned in the when the yoga group in Thailand, that if the person feels they are being abused, then it gets turned back on them. That it's your weakness. You need to get through this because this is a problem for you. It's not what we're doing that's the problem.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because this is the most insidious thing, right? And it's not just in the New Age spiritual yoga world, it's across the board. It was at Centerpoint, and we see it at Gloryville, and we see it in all the extreme Christian fundamentalist evangelical groups. It's this whole thing of there are no victims. Don't play the victim. If you're not happy here, if you have a problem, if you have a mental health problem, you haven't practiced hard enough. You haven't prayed enough.
It's
you
your
haven't
fault.
followed the program. You don't believe in the teacher enough. You basically failed. Yeah.
It's gaslighting.
Try
isn't
harder, and you could take another course and pay us more and to try harder. So it's I think this is almost the worst. Is this victim blaming, spiritual bypassing, and there's no room for accountability for those who actually who are doing the wrong. And we'll be talking some serious harm here, like Gloryville and so on, where children who have been sexually abused were brought into meetings with servants and shepherds and had to forgive the perpetrators. A 9-year-old had to forgive the perpetrators, and these girls were shamed themselves, were blamed, also as teenagers, for showing a bit, just a little bit of skin around their ankle or whatever made them too seductive, and therefore these men couldn't help themselves. And I've heard it over and over again, and it's no different from in lots of ways from what you encounter in the spiritual New Age world as well, where it's, you're playing the victim, you're stuck in that consciousness. Why did you attract that? What made, maybe there's some great learning in there that someone came and did that to you. And now you should be grateful for this person who harmed you, that they're giving you this massive opportunity to grow, right? I know.
But also that mirrors some societal thinking. I mean, for how long in Western societies were women who were raped and assaulted demonized? Well, she shouldn't have worn that. She shouldn't have gone into that area. The victim, and it still happens, particularly in some countries to this day, that the man is not held culpable often. It's the woman's fault that she's in that position.
Yeah, I mean, nothing that happens in cults doesn't happen outside society too, usually. I mean, there's some cults like Nexium in the US where the inner circle women got branded at some point. I mean, there's certainly maybe some extreme things like, Jonestown and the mass suicide there. But in general, the oppression, the shaming, the victim, and all of these dynamics are also in wider society. But in a cult, you have them really compressed. And ironically enough, often, cultic groups always think they're at the forefront of evolution, of change. And maybe they don't call themselves progressives, but they think of themselves as we're the ones. If everyone just did what we did, the world would be a better place. And ironically enough, they often just copy paste so many patriarchal, structures and dynamics that are just absolutely awful. And yeah, there are many patriarchs right in our midst, and here in New Zealand, especially in Aotearoa, where we have such a, at least we had a very progressive female-led government, and we're a beacon in the world for feminism and
That's right.
equality and all of that. And then we have these places here in our midst, and it's just to really say this again. I mean, I'm absolutely passionate about changing, stopping, exposing Gloryville, but also there are other groups who operate in a similar way, where people don't all live in a compound, they don't all wear the same clothes. I mean, I'm looking at the Exclusive Brethren and quite a few others, and 2x2s and Jehovah's Witnesses, and I know they're all litigious, so I'm going to be careful what I'm saying here. No, seriously, they are. Another marker for a cult, Andrew, is they are very litigious, and they like to come after journalists. But I mean, the same dynamics, a lot of the same dynamics apply to a lot of groups here that just stay under the radar or are just sort of accepted as religious communities, and under the disguise of religious freedom, some real human rights.
Absolutely.
Issues are happening, and religious freedom should never trump other human rights, I think.
One of the things that stood out very starkly for me is this very deep, twisted form of misogyny. It's not as simple as a man wants dominion over woman. It's actually the complete systematic devaluing of a woman in terms of almost making them objects that feels extremely odd to me, particularly husbands to wives in these places and even to daughters, that they are almost seen as chattels.
Yes, I think in Global it's absolutely fair to say that they are seen as chattels. They are treated like chattel. The slave labor they do, the breeding, and also just keep in mind if your status as a woman goes up if you have 10 or 12 kids, but at the same time your status goes down if you're just a little bit overweight and you're constantly in this battle and you have to work around the clock. And as someone who's only given birth twice, yeah, 2 kids, gosh, I mean, these women who are just working around the clock, who are worn out from childbirth, their bodies are suffering, they don't often get the proper health care they need, let alone any mental health care, because that's frowned upon. The suicidal ideation in Gloria Bell is huge. And so they're just expected to be breeding and also to be sexually available for their husbands. That's actually in their in their scripture, so to speak. It's actually part of their dogma is that you're making yourself available all the time, no matter what physical status you're in after having given birth. And learning that through my research was pretty shocking. I thought I'd seen and heard it all.
In all of these situations that certainly that you've looked at, and you've done research that's wider than just these ones in New Zealand or Thailand, is it always men who are at the top of it?
No, not interestingly enough, not. Yes, the majority are men. This is why, cults are a feminist issue because more women than men are in cults and more men than women are cult leaders. So you have that dynamic. But there are a few, and probably a growing number now of cultic groups that are led by women, like One Taste or Orgasmic Meditation in the United States. I actually visited them for one weekend, 1 week as a sort of semi-professional cult tourist. And also, I think, especially in the new agey world, you see more and more female influencers who become grifters and then potentially, cult leaders. But it's a new phenomenon. And interesting enough, with the One Taste Orgasmic Meditation cult, it's then dressed up as female empowerment. It's complex because in that context, actually, there are allegations of rape again, and how women just need to learn to surrender to be fully empowered. I know, right? Yeah. So there's, I wouldn't be surprised if we see, anything could turn into a culty group. You could, we know that flat earthers can be culty, or there's certain content that already lends itself to being culty. But
things like Fox News too. So a lot of the misinformation on the and some of it, I guess, is coming from other countries too.
Yes.
So a lot of the misinformation around elections is coming from China and Russia. So it's systematic stuff.
Yes.
And I guess as humans, I mean, we've been manipulating each other from playgrounds through to television advertising through to whatever for a very long time. And we think of these things as such as cults on the fringe, but they're actually using techniques that all of us could potentially be guilty of ourselves.
Absolutely, and I think it's good to just sort of drop the old stereotype of what we think a cult looks like those weirdos sitting there over in the Hare Krishna temple and chanting and wearing orange or following some kind of leader. It's right, it's amongst us, and it's not always the extreme. The extreme forms get noticed. This is when finally, they hit the headlines when something really bad happens, when there's a cult disaster. But I think let's nip this in the bud and just be not in a vigilant way, but more in a self-critical, more like in a self-aware way of spotting it around us.
I wanted to ask you about the process of doing all of this. And obviously you've done interviews with perpetrators, you've done interviews with people who are survivors of these kinds of situations. It's always difficult as a journalist to try and sift out what is the truth, particularly because trauma can alter people's memories and so on. And so I'm wondering, for you as a journalist, how did you try and ensure And do you feel that you got to as close to the truth as you possibly could with the reporting that you've done?
Yeah, it's difficult because not everything is public record, and a lot of things can't be established in hard data if it wasn't dealt with in the courts. And even then, I've definitely with Centrepoint, I've faced the problem that there were a lot of things that didn't end up in the courts. And yes, I mean, it's a massive dilemma because you think you got the story on one person, and then someone else tells you something else about them that probably that suddenly contradicts all that. And what I've learned over the years, especially when I pulled it all together for my last book for Cult Trip, was to actually have one person, at least one person from each of those culture groups that I completely trusted from my years of research with them and around all the issues with this group, who were my fact checkers also, where I knew they don't have an agenda. They're reliable. They were almost like the historians of the place at the time, or I could be that. So I always had someone from within tow where I knew I can run things past them if there isn't anyone there on site. And it's tricky because you there's a legal risk, of course, if you get something wrong, but also there's the moral, the reputational risk, and also just you could be damaging people immensely by just getting a lot of things wrong that might not be even incriminating them, but it's so much is at stake there, especially if I'm reporting about a former sex cult where children were abused. So even to be associated with it is, for some people, it's just they just closed the door on me. So that's part of the reason why it got so extremely difficult, which is, I mean, it's true for everyone who's doing a big investigation for any media outlet. It's nothing new what I did there. I think it's just that it accumulated into so much that I didn't see coming, and not that I was naive, but I wasn't prepared for it. I hadn't done sexual abuse reporting before. And also, I didn't have a newsroom around me. I didn't have colleagues. I was on my own. Even the publishing, the editor who signed me up for the publishing house had left shortly after she commissioned me, and I was completely on my own, and I had actually no one to go to. Nicky Hager became an amazing mentor for a while, and he was here. I was already really drowning when I found him, and Nicky said, "Look, I'm here for you." And some of the really complicated cases, I could run past him, and I also had a pro bono lawyer through him, Wellington, who looked at some of the stuff. But in the end, it was still me having to take on the trauma of others, and that rubbed off, and it just became this sea of darkness that I thought I was drowning in. Yeah.
But you sailed through it.
Well, I mean, I pulled the plug on the initial Centrepoint book after 2 years. I couldn't finish the book. I pulled out, or actually the publisher then decided, the deadline was coming up, and I had legal threats, and there were so many open ends and so many unresolvable issues. If this was if I'd been a reporter for Stuff or the Herald or Ansett, I could have sat down with my bosses and we could have found a solution. But in this case, there really wasn't one, apart from just saying, just can't do it, or the publisher couldn't do it. And so I stopped it all. But then I actually still wrote the making of the Centrepoint research for North and South back then. Came out in 2015 and actually led to 2 documentaries and the Centrepoint Restoration Project, started by a former child from Centrepoint, now a medical doctor here in Christchurch. She's amazing, and she's going to be a speaker at the DECULT conference. So, out of the failure, actually, a lot of good things have come, and she's just been in touch with me today. We're doing a session, a panel together at the International Cultic Studies Association conference in Barcelona in July. So I see myself surrounded with some incredible people here in Aotearoa, also from the Gloria Leaver Support Trust or the Olive Leaf Network in Wellington, and they're all really passionate to do something about this. And I feel quite honored because I'm not a cult survivor, I'm not a cult expert. I'm really just a journalist who came to close, but I think I have a voice and I have a bit of insight, and I want to use this as long as I can. Yeah.
So just finally, I guess, as an encapsulation of what we've been talking about, what someone who reads the book, what's the most important thing for you that they take away from it?
That everyone's susceptible. That it doesn't matter what they teach or preach in the group, that the dynamics are similar, and that sexuality is a means of controlling people, whether it's amplified or whether it's suppressed, whether it's on steroids or whether it's, it's purity culture. I think it's a really interesting thing to understand that it runs across all these cultic groups. It's not just the so-called quote-unquote sex cults, which is not a great term anyway. Yeah, and I think another takeaway is really what we talked about before. Just don't think of yourself as being, above that. We just don't know what we would be like. And it's time for cult justice. It's time for accountability. It's time for repair work. And I'm really looking at the former Centrepoint adults here. 20, 30 years later, where are they? A few of them, too few of them have shown up and signed an open letter that was started by the Centrepoint Restoration Project a few years ago. Where are they willing to do the repair work with their children who are adults who suffered in these broken families? It's never too late for that, but I would love to see more accountability, and I wouldn't, and not the old narratives still being thrown around and people being manipulated behind the scenes, former victims, so that they can't speak up. It's just unbelievable what's still happening in the Centrepoint space. I'm still watching it, and I can't believe it. But we need to talk about it.
Well, yeah,
we're doing it, Andrew. I'm glad you are. I'm glad you read my book. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and I really appreciate you taking time out to talk about this with me.
Thank you.